So guys, today the projector is not working, so we'll operate without the projector. We'll finish legal discourse today, and then we'll move on to mood and modality. Okay? For those of you who are watching my video at home, so I will attach the PowerPoint file online. So last time we looked at legal discourse, right? Remember? And legal discourse is characterized by this kind of long sentences. Do you remember that, right? That because there is the need to be accurate, right? And the need to be very detailed because, you know, legal discourse, when you write laws, you have to come up with something that's accurate so that people have no vagueness or no problems with what you specify, right? A law has to be clear and it has to be detailed. So that's why a sentence can be long as 50 words in it or maybe 100 words in a sentence and so, right? And so the technique that we use when we analyze legal discourse is that we just have to find the subject, right? We have to find the main clause and we have to find the subordinate clause, right? And then we find the subject and the verb of the main clause, right? And last time we talked about there are many patterns, left branching, right? In legal discourse where you have like a lot of subordinate clause here and then subordinate clause and then the main clause is here, right? So that's what we call left branching because the subordinate clauses are to the left hand of the main clause. So everything is defined in relation to the main clause, right? And then we have right branching. That's what we talked about last time. Right branching is when you have the subordinate clauses to the right, like this, subordinate clauses to the right of the main clause, like that, right? And you also have like something that's in the middle. We call it nested or embedded, right? Where you have subordinate clauses like inside the main clause. Maybe this is the main clause, and then you have subordinate clauses inside, like that. So as long as you can identify the main clause and you identify the subject and the verb in there, you're going to be able to read and analyze legal discourse. Okay? So there are only 3 patterns or so, right? And also legal discourse can be characterized by the use of lots of ands and or. So you need to pay attention to what are being joined by and or. Like noun phrase 1 and noun phrase 2 and noun phrase 3 and so on, right? So like that. So as long as you can identify like what are being joined, then you should be able to see the structure. Okay? And last time we also looked at different modals that people use in legal discourse, right? And we looked at some examples, like maybe the first 5 examples on the handout last time, right? That we didn't get to finish. So we'll finish that today. And most of the things that we saw last time are direct strategies, right? Because in legal discourse, you would expect things to be direct, right? That when they impose some kind of order on you, on the reader, then you have to be direct because legal discourse has to be accurate, right? And has to be detailed. So most of modalities, most of the modal verbs that we saw last time are direct strategies and they have to do with prohibition, right? And prohibition, so that's deontic. And also obligation, that's also deontic, right? That's what we saw last time. In the use of shall, for example. Shall in this case doesn't mean like will in the sense of likelihood of something happening, but it means someone has some obligation to do it, right? That person shall not, and so on, right? So it has to do with prohibition and obligation. So that's what we talked about last time. Now, let's go on to number 6. So again, the projector is broken, so we just have to follow the handout here. We were on number 5, right? So now we move to number 6. Number 6, if you look at number 6, the first shall, that the main clause, where is the main clause? So we need to look at where the main clause is first, right? So the main clause is where? This is an example of, number 6 is an example of what we call left branching, right? Left branching. At least in the first paragraph, left branching. Because you start off with the word where. You see that? Where. Where is like the location, right? So where, by reference to a contract term, or notice a person seeks to restrict liability. So that's left branching. That's where the subordinate clause is. Where is subordinate clause. So the main clause is to the right of the subordinate clause. So the main clause is where? The main clause is in the third line. You see third line? After the comma, regard shall be had in particular. So that's the main clause, which sounds like very strange because it's in the passive voice and we don't usually do that, right, in spoken language. Regard shall be had in particular to something. So that's the main clause. Regard shall be had in particular to, meaning we should pay regard to, we should pay attention to A, B, and C, like that. So that's the main clause. So the main clause has shall. What kind of modal is shall here? It's direct, right? Direct strategy, and it's also obligation, right? So in other words, reader must pay attention to, right? Regard shall be had to, meaning readers must pay attention to. So shall in this case is obligation, so it's deontic, and it's what we call the direct strategy, because it's direct command, direct suggestion, right? So that's what we'll do for this one. And then another modal that you see is maybe in line 5 after A. You see that? The resources which he could expect to be available to him. The resources which he could expect to be available to him. In this case, could indicate like low, right? Low degree of possibility or low degree of permission, right? So in this case, it's kind of ambiguous. It could be both. Okay? So in this case, could be both deontic and could be both epistemic. But it indicates low degree of either deontic or epistemic force, because it's just a kind of unlikely event, hypothetical situation, right? Could instead of can, for example, right? So the resources which he could expect could mean which he is allowed to expect, right? So deontic in that case, or which he is likely to expect, in that case epistemic. So it's, in this case, it's ambiguous, either one or the other, okay, or both. And then next line, we have liability should it arise, right? Should it arise, you see that? It should arise. In this case, it's clearly epistemic. Should. Should indicates possibility of something arising, right? In other words, if it should arise, if it should arise. In English, if it should arise is equal to should it arise without the if, like that, same thing. So this indicates the likelihood, right? So I can say, for example, should you have some questions, just email me, like that. Should you have, meaning in the maybe unlikely event that you have questions, like that. Okay. The last modal that we see in number 6 is maybe the last but one line, the last but one. So visions of the convention would, if they had the force of law in relation to the contract, impose liability on him, right? So in this case, it's deontic, right? So the law would impose, would, and then the verb is impose. The law would impose liability on him. So this is like the what the law would do, right? So it's deontic because it has to do with obligation, it has to do with permission, and so on. Okay. So that's number 6. Number 7. A person dealing as consumer cannot be made to indemnify another person. Indemnify means to compensate, to pay. In other words, to make up for loss or damage, to compensate. So a person cannot be made to indemnify another person, and so on. So in this case, it's prohibition. Okay. So you cannot do this, you cannot do that, you may not do this, you may not do that. So it's deontic. Okay? So they don't allow that person to be made to pay other people. Okay? And then in the second line, you have that may be incurred, right? In this case, it's clear that it's epistemic because it has to do with probability. May be incurred, meaning may happen. Okay? It's likely to happen. Right? Has some likelihood of happening, so it's epistemic. Okay? So there are only 2 in this one. Number 8. Kakao Talk. Number 8. The following enactments shall not apply to any contract. Shall not, meaning it is not allowed to, right, apply. So we have deontic here, prohibition, deontic, and it's also direct. Same as the third line, where the guarantee shall not be enforceable against the guarantor. So shall not, both shall not have the sense of obligation and permission, so they are deontic. Okay? Number 9. Number 9, the modal verb is in line 2. That's the main clause. The court may, and where's the verb? The court may, the verb is in line 3. The court may include such sum as appears to be reasonable. May here is permission. Okay? So the court is entitled to do this or to do that. The court is allowed by the law to do this or to do that. Okay? So it's deontic. I think there's only one there. So let's move on to the last one. The last one, cases where contracts need not be under seal. So when you sign a contract, like when you buy a phone from Samsung, when you buy a phone from LG, you have to sign a contract for maybe 24 months or so, right? So that's what you have to read when you sign a contract. Contract law is very pervasive in our life, so you should know contract laws in your country. So they talk about contract laws here. Need not be under seal. Under seal meaning to make it very official, to make it formal by both sides, signing it, and then with some kind of seal, like tojang, stamp. Okay, seal is stamp. Number 1, contracts may be made on behalf of any body corporate. So may be. So in this case, it's allowed to be. So a contract is allowed to be made on behalf of anyone, right? So it's permission, so it's deontic. And then next is line 3. Signed by parties to be charged therewith may be made on behalf. Same thing, deontic, permission. And the last but one line, not reduced into writing may be made by parole on behalf. So may be made, right? May be, so is allowed to. So all of these mays indicate permission. So they are all deontic in force. Okay? And so you can see that, to sum up, in legal discourse that we see, all modals are, most modal verbs are deontic in terms of force. and some of them are epistemic, right? But all of them involve like direct strategies that tell people to do this or to do that, or not to do this or not to do that. So that's kind of this characteristic of legal discourse. Okay? So it's hard to do. Let's move on to the next thing, which is moods and modality. It's hard to do this without something that we like look at together. So I hope that you guys have already printed out the PowerPoint slides. So since this thing is not working today, so we'll go over each slide, and I will give you the kind of the cues as to which slide I'm on. Okay. So today we'll talk about the mood system in English and contrast it with modality. Okay. So we have talked about modality, right? So modality has to do with the status. Remember, modality has to do with the status of a proposition. Meaning, you have a proposition, meaning you have an utterance, like utterance X, right? Let's say, Gil-ho is late, right? That's a proposition, or Gil-ho be late. Let's make it infinitive, okay? And then when you put in some kind of modality, right? Whether it's deontic or whether it's epistemic, you indicate the status of that proposition as being epistemic, meaning being likely or not likely, as being obligated to happen or not obligated to happen. Like if I have may here, so the may would be like that, right? So so this is modality. So it indicates the status of that proposition as Gil-ho may be late. If it's epistemic, then it indicates it as being very likely. He may be late, right? Or if it's deontic, it indicates that proposition as being allowed to happen, right? Gil-ho can be late. I allow him to be late, and so on, right? So this is like modality. And it indicates the status of a proposition. So it's like the modality here stands like apart from the content of the proposition, like that. And then today we'll look at mood. Okay, today we'll look at mood and look at and contrast it with modality. Okay. On the first page of the PowerPoint file, I have language as choice, right? So again, every time we have to come back to this idea that, you know, in a language you have so many choices to choose from, right? And whatever choice you choose, it's meaningful because it's different from other choices that you use, right? That you choose. Like example, you know, the reason why I choose Gil-ho, why do I choose him here instead of Jun-song or other people, right? There must be some reason, right? So language is just like that. You know, the words that we choose, structure that we choose is like that, right? So, so choices are made on many levels, right? And you can have either active, passive, or middle voice, and so on, right? Middle voice, you know, middle voice is the voice that, like something like, I don't know, the book sells well, like that. It's people don't usually say it like the book is sold well, even though you know that the book cannot sell itself, right? Or the food cooks well, or something like that. So even though you know that somebody must cook the food, we prefer to use not the passive voice. So we call something like this the middle voice, which we can talk about some other time, okay? So the choice whether you do it like this or you use like the passive voice or the active voice is meaningful, Okay. So next slide. Let's turn to next slide. In addition to modality, so we talked about modality last week, right? In addition to modality, many languages make distinction between factual assertion and various kinds of non-factuality by marking the verb form. So when we talked about the distinction between mood versus modality, so modality is just the status. We just talked about that, right? The status of a proposition like may, and then that's the proposition. As that proposition is likely to happen or is allowed to happen. So there are only two ways, right? But when we talk about mood, we primarily talk about the fact that some languages, including English and including Korean, mark a proposition as factual or non-factual, like that. Okay? Factual or non-factual, not just the status of the proposition, but they use some kind of endings, right? They use some kind of endings to mark a proposition as either it's a fact or not, or non-factual, not a fact. Okay? Unlike modality, the mood system is broader than modality because it includes both what is factual and what's non-factual, right? When we talk about modality, it's all non-factual, right? He may be late. That's non-factual because it has not happened yet, right? Or I allow him to be late, or I don't allow him to be late. Whatever is non-factual. But when we talk about mood, we include something that is factual as well. So mood is kind of broader than modality. And modality would be under here, right? Because modality is kind of subset of non-factual thing, right? But English is very impoverished. This is on that slide. Impoverished meaning very poor in terms of verbal inflections. We don't usually add things like endings to verbs because we don't have any endings in English that indicate moods, right? But in other languages, people mark a proposition as factual or non-factual based on the endings on the verb. Okay? So if you look at the next slide, two major mood choices. So I said that some languages mark the verb as factual or non-factual. So there are two kinds, right? Factual is what we call realist, the realist mood. And the non-factual is what we call the irrealist mood. Irrealist mood. So realist and irrealist mood. So real and non-real, right? So the realist mood, so we are on the slide, two major mood choices, okay? So the realist mood is the mood that portrays situations as actualized. As actualized. A situation as actualized. A situation is represented or portrayed as actualized. Actualized meaning to do, or to make, or to realize, meaning it's as done, right? As having occurred or as actually occurring. So actually occurring right now, for example, or as having occurred, meaning already occurred, right? So in other words, that's the fact, right? It has already happened. It's a fact. It's actually occurring, meaning it's occurring right now. So all of these are like fact, right? So that's what the realist mood does, okay? And for the realist mood, we have two minor moods. We have indicative, and then we also have what else? Maybe two or three evidentials, and then we also have mirative, right? So I'll explain what each is. So the indicative mood is like the just regular present tense that we use, like it's unmarked, right? The examples on the slide are Paul is eating an apple and the sun goes around the earth. So this indicative is just unmarked. It's just something that we report, that we use to report facts with. The sun goes around the moon, Gil-ho was late, Gil-ho is late always, like whatever. So that's the indicative mood, okay? And then the evidential, let's look at the next slide. Evidential has to do with providing some kind of evidence, right? So some languages some languages mark the statement or the proposition based on what kind of sensory perception. So whether the speaker knows the fact from seeing it, from touching it, from smelling it, whatever. So based on sensory perception, right? So indicating that he has some kind of evidence to back up that statement. Like in English, we do this when we say, I see that he is late. I hear that he is late. I see or I hear, that's evidential. In English, we don't mark on the verb, but we use like separate verbs. I see or I hear, right? Or according to her, David failed the class. According to, that's your evidence, right? That, this is like a hearsay. You hear it from someone, right? Or David reportedly failed the class. Reportedly, you know that the speaker doesn't have a first-hand experience, but it's reported, right? So this kind of thing. So it's evidentials. In Korean, you mark it on the verb. You don't use like separate words as in English. In English, we use like reportedly, which is an adverb. We use according to her, which is like a prepositional phrase. But in Korean, you use it, you mark the verb, right? Like today morning is very cold. Yesterday, the rain came. Yesterday, it rained, for example, right? You use like 피가 왔나보아, right? So the verb plus or that the vowel, and then 나보다. So that's like evidential in Korean. So you mark it on the verb. You attach some kind of verb to the ending, right, of the first verb. So that's evidential in Korean. That's still indicative mood, though, because it indicates what's the fact, right? The last one is the mirative. The mirative here. Mirative conveys a new or surprising fact to the speaker. It's indicative mood because it talks about the fact, right? But in this case, the mirative conveys the fact that it's surprising or it's some kind of like new to the speaker. Like you use ne in Korean, right? You mark it on the verb, like neyo, right? Or ne, very difficult to me. Or you use like guna, Krista ikuna, like that, right? Or gunyo, right? Guna, gunyo, ne, like this. So they're all like mirative, indicating that the speaker is very surprised about the fact, right? But English, do we do this? No. We don't do it on the verb. We use like words like, oh, even Gil-ho is late. Even, like indicating that it's surprising, right? So we just talked about different like minor moods under the factual or the realist mood of English, okay, and other languages. Now, let's move to the second side, which is irrealist. So we switch to the next slide, irrealist. So irrealist indicates that something is not a fact. It portrays situations as purely within the realm of thought, right? So it portrays situations as purely within the realm, within the realm or the domain of thought only, right? So it has to do with necessity, possibility, requirement, wish, desiring, fear, and so on. So it includes modality that we studied last week, right? So modality is here, right? Modality expresses like likelihood or permission. So verbs are marked to show events which have not happened yet, or are not likely to happen, or are far removed from the real reality, right? In English, we do that with like we use just past tense to indicate that if only I had money, right? The past tense form of have, like had, indicates that it's not true, it's counterfactual, right? If you had done your homework, you wouldn't have failed the class. So this is counterfactual as well. So we mark it on the verb, right? We use the past tense. English has only 2 tenses, present or past. So you want to indicate that it's far from reality, you use past tense like that, with if, right? With the word if. But in Korean, you use so many things, right? You use verb plus 는 타면, or you use verb plus at, ot, 더라면, like that, right? So in Korean, you do it too. So this is what we call irrealist. So just by looking at the marker, you know that it's not true, right? When you see 타면 or 더라면, you know that it's not true, okay? The irrealist mood might consist of minor moods, like this is on the next slide. The next slide shows like the minor irrealist mood. For example, the subjunctive mood. Subjunctive has to do with the subjective feeling of the speaker, right? So when you discuss imaginary or hypothetical events, so you in English we mark it. We don't mark it because there's nothing on the verb. If you look at the 2 examples on the next slide, I suggest that Paul eat an apple and John would eat if he were hungry. In the first one, we use 0 marking. Eat has no S ending. In the second one, we use the past tense marking, right? So English can only do it, can only do like that, right? That is subjunctive, without S or past tense. That indicates the desire or kind of the hypothetical situation. So that's the subjunctive move. And it's irrealist because it's not real, right? It's desire, or expressing suggestion or making polite requests and so on. Next one, we have the imperative mood. Imperative mood is when you indicate commands, when you issue commands or issue like imperatives to other people, and that's not real either. It's your desire for them to listen to you, to obey what you ask them to do, right? So in this case, in English, we don't mark it either, right? So we just use the infinitive. Do your homework. Let us do the homework. Don't you dare. If you go eastward a mile, or so and so on. We just usually don't mark the verb, right? But in Korean, you mark it, right? If you look at the next slide, the Korean information for the imperative move, you mark it like 으세요, for example, right? Or 주세요, to do that for me, and so on, right? So in Korean, you mark the verb, but in English, we just use no marking. So it's kind of like very poor system in English because we only have 2 tenses and we just have to make do with 2 tenses, okay? And finally, if you look at the next slide, we have the deontic and epistemic. So under irrealist, we have so many things like epistemic, deontic, subjunctive, and also imperative, and so on. So these are all irrealist because they are not factual and they have to do with the speaker's desire or suggestion or wish and so on. Okay? We studied deontic and epistemic last week, and today we mentioned subjective and imperative and so on. So in terms of marking the verbs, in English we use either modals, like for these we use modals to mark the verb, or we use no marking at all, 0, or we use past tense. That's all we have. We don't have like sentence endings or verb endings like ne, kuna, kunyo. We don't have any of those, right? And finally, we have the interrogative mood. Interrogative is when we ask questions like that, right? So next time we'll look at questions. Why do people ask questions in places where they know that the reader or the listener cannot answer questions, right? So like, why do I use questions in class, right? Do I expect answers? Sometimes I do, but sometimes I don't, right? So we'll look at why people might use interrogatives or questions when they talk. So today we looked at, to sum up, we look at 2 systems, like mood and modality systems, right? And we say that mood consists of marking on the verb as factual or non-factual. Right? And we look at the realist mood and the irrealist mood, and we look at some minor moods within each system. Right? Now, the next topic that I want to talk about is the strength of modality or mood. So strength has to do with the kind of the degree, right? The kind of the degree. So if we talk about epistemic first, so epistemic has to do with likelihood, right? So we can indicate like 3 or 4 levels of strength. High and then fact. So let's look at epistemic first, okay? When we talk about strength, we can combine the factual and non-factual together, okay? So epistemic has to do with likelihood, you know, right? So we have different degrees like low, median, high, and factual or factuality, right? So the low degree would be things like might or could, like that, or possibly, like that. So that's low degree, meaning the speaker is not sure, very, very unsure about the likelihood of something, right? So that's low. And the median strength category include things like may or can, like that. That can happen. That may happen, like that. So usually the past tense form indicates low degree, and then higher degree would be the present tense form. Okay? And the high degree, which is higher than median, of course, we have things like must and will. That must be him at the door or something. That will be the milkman at the door. So this is higher than that, than the median, right? So must and will. And then when you do it as a fact, meaning when you do it as a realist mood, you just say that is what already happened or it's what is happening, right? So it is, just unmarked, right? It is, let's say, the mailman at the door. Right? So if you take the same sentence and use these things, you kind of feel that there are different degrees of commitment. That might be the mailman, that may be the mailman, that must be the mailman, and that is the mailman, right? So different varying degrees of commitment. Commitment meaning how sure you are. Of course, fact is a fact, and it must be like highest degree possible, right? So that's the epistemic side. Now, the deontic side is kind of the same. So for the deontic side, you can categorize it to low, median, high, and facts as well. Right? So for the low degree, we could do things like something like, let's start with the high degree. You must, let's say must, like do X. Kind of the same thing. Okay? And this is like you can or you may do X, like that. Same thing. And then you could do that, do X, like that. And highest might be the imperative. Remember, do X, like that. So that's the imperative. And then the fact might be I ask you to do it. To do X. So that's fact, right? So the two systems, the two systems, deontic and epistemic, are kind of parallel. So what you have as the low degree, what you have as the medium degree, what you have as the high degree, they kind of are parallel. They are the same. Okay, but one side expresses like likelihood, and the other side expresses obligation, and so on. So you could do that, and when you read something, you should be careful as to whether the information, whether you read newspaper, whatever, you have to be careful as to whether the information is presented as factual, or presented as having some kind of different degrees, varying degrees of commitment, right? So that's what we talked about today. So today we talked about modality strength, we talked about moods, we talked about let's see, the differences between the mood and modality, right? So on the handout, you have part of his speech before he actually ordered the army to go into Afghanistan to clear out that country, right? So we'll analyze his speech as to his different degrees of certainty and different degrees of obligation that he imposed upon other people. Okay, so and we'll try to put different modals or different factual statements in the corresponding column below. So the first table you have epistemic modality strength. So that's epistemic. And on the second page you have on the other side you have deontic strength, right? So first you have to consider whether it's deontic or epistemic, right? And whether it's factual or non-factual. So if you start out from the beginning, sentence 1, I numbered is sentence for you. So if you start out from the first sentence, we have good afternoon, so we don't do that. On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against Al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, right? So in this case, you see that it's not marked with any modal, right? Any modal verb, no modal verb. So it is likely to be a fact, right? So it's a fact, right? So it's factual. In this case, it's realist mode, right? Now, but you see that there's a prepositional phrase in the front, on my orders, right? So on my order, they have begun the strikes, right? So on my order, that's deontic, right? Deontic because it has to do with what they are supposed to do, what they are asked to do is deontic, but it's presented as a fact, right? So we put this in the deontic form, in the deontic table on the back. So we have on my orders, so I underline orders, and because that indicates deontic, right? But it's presented as fact, right? So in this case, he presented it as a fact, right? And it's kind of low in terms of forcefulness, meaning that he already did it, right? And that statement, the U.S. military has begun strikes. That statement has no kind of force on the listener, right? So it's low in that case, but it's presented as a fact, meaning that he has the authority to do it, right? On my orders and so on. So we put that under the deontic side and in the fact column. Okay, so that's how we do it. And in the second one, these carefully targeted actions are designed to disrupt the use of Afghanistan as a terrorist base. That's his excuse, or that's his argument, right? Sorry. So in this case, these carefully targeted actions are designed to disrupt. Do you see any modal, or do you see any kind of modality expressions here? In number 2, there's no modal, right? So it's presented as a fact again, right? So they are designed too. So he presented it as a fact, but in this case, it's epistemic modality, right? Because it doesn't have to do with obligation or anything like that, but it states of a knowledge, right? Kind of information, right? So we put it under factuality, under the epistemic table, right? Under epistemic heading. So you see that I already did that for you, number 2. So can you do number 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on? So put them in the corresponding columns or table, or table. Okay? So I'll walk around to help you. Many of these are going to be factual, but also maybe maybe a large group of the sentences might be deontic or epistemic, okay, or they might be ambiguous. So just use your judgment. Like number 3, we are joined in this operation by our staunch friend, Great Britain, and so on. So we are joined, like presented using the indicative mood, right, as a fact, right? And you can classify it under epistemic because it's fact, it's knowledge, right? So number 3 would be there, we are joined, right? And number 4, other close friends, they call them friends, including Canada, Australia, Germany, and France, have pledged forces as the operation unfolds. So in this case, no modality expressions, and it's presented as a fact as well, right, under epistemic. So number 4 too. And number 5, more than 40 countries in the Middle East, Africa, and Europe, across Asia, have granted air transit or landing rights. Again, this has no modals, so it's presented as a fact under epistemic, under the epistemic category. So it's interesting that except for number 1, or maybe including number 1, up to here, he presented everything as factual, right? Meaning that he is so certain, right? He is so certain that other people have joined force to do this war, to wage this war on Afghanistan, right? So this is kind of a strong a statement that he can make, right? Because when he makes statement like this, of course he didn't write it by himself, right? He must have some kind of speechwriter to help him. And it's important which category of modality or mood system you would use. When you want to present yourself as very strong and very kind of certain of what you want to do, you have to make it as fact, right? Like this, from number 1 to number 5. He's so sure that other nations, or he makes it very certain that other nations agree with what he wants to do, and so on, right? So everything is presented as a fact here. But maybe from number 6 onward, you might see things that are different in terms of degrees of commitment. So I'll give you maybe 10 minutes to label these things, and we'll talk about the different degrees. Left. Number 6, more than 2 weeks ago, I gave Taliban leaders a series of clear and specific demands. So that's a fact, right? 2 weeks ago, that's what already happened. No modal, not what he wished could have happened, and so on. So it's a fact, but it's a fact that has to do with deontic modality, right? So because you see clear and specific demands. So demands has to do with the obligation he has on the listener, right? So you list it under the deontic table, and it's a fact. So in the first column, okay? Number 6. And number 6, it continues with a series of imperatives, right? Close terrorist training camps, hand over leaders of the Al-Qaeda network, and return of foreign nationals, including American citizens and so on. So all of these are commands. So you list them under the deontic table and under the in the command column, right? So we have close, hand over, and return all of these people, okay? And then number 7, none of these demands was met. None of these demands was met, right? So in this case, its epistemic modality is just a piece of information. Factuality, you list it under factuality because there's no modality, right? None of these demands was met. And now the Taliban will pay a price. Continue with number 7. Will pay a price. In this case, as I explained it, will can be both epistemic or deontic, right? So it's like he's telling the Taliban to pay a price. So that's his desire. He's like indicating what they should do, right? So you can list it under a high degree of deontic, like that. Or Taliban will pay a price, indicating his certainty. So you could list the same thing under high and epistemic, okay? Because it could be both, right? So high epistemic or high deontic could be both. So he can take advantage of this kind of ambiguity, you know, ambiguity, right? So he takes advantage, Bush is taking advantage of this kind of ambiguity. Ambiguity meaning the fact that things could be both. Ambi is like both, right? Ambiguity, he takes advantage of this ambiguity of epistemic and deontic modality to manipulate the listener or to influence us to agree with him, right? Will pay a price is high, so on the one hand it could indicate his epistemic belief, right? That he's so certain that they will do that. So the listener, when they hear this, the listeners, they will kind of likely be like encouraged to agree with him and so on, right? And number 8, by destroying camps and disrupting communications, we will make it more difficult for the terror network to train new recruits and so on. We will. Again, in this case, it could be both epistemic or deontic under high, the high column, right? High epistemic or high deontic, right? It indicates the deontic, which is our intention. We will do that together, right? Or we will, meaning it's very, very likely that this will happen. The difficulty would happen, and so on, right? So it could be both. Again, he's taking advantage of the ambiguity of will to be both epistemic and deontic to manipulate the listener, okay? To show that he's so firm on the one hand and to show that this is his intention on the other hand. Okay? So we'll come back and do number 9 to number last one on Wednesday, okay?